In the opulent heart of a Michelin-starred restaurant, Marcus Harrington, a self-made billionaire, sits surrounded by whispers and luxury, but haunted by the ghosts of his past. 8 years after breaking the billion-dollar barrier, Marcus's life might look perfect, yet it's a hollow echo of financial success and personal sacrifice. Hidden behind the polished facade of Harrington Technologies, an AI powerhouse changing the medical world, lies a man who struggles with the shadows cast by his father's mysterious legacy. As Marcus stares at his most prized possession, a rare watch sent by the father who once vanished without a trace, the cracks in his armor threaten to widen, with secrets lurking just below the surface. Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. The Michelin-starred restaurant gleamed with polished glass and silver, the kind of place where whispers replace conversation and the price of wine could fund a modest car. Marcus Harrington sat alone at his usual corner table, partially obscured by an arrangement of white orchids that the staff always positioned just so, not to hide him, but to frame him like the valuable asset he was to the establishment. His reflection fragmented across the crystal tumbler as he swirled 18-year-old scotch, the amber liquid catching the light from the chandelier overhead. 8 years had passed since Marcus had crossed the billion-dollar threshold, transforming from merely wealthy to that rarefied air where money ceased to be currency and instead became pure abstraction. The evening stretched before him like all the others. A meticulously prepared meal he would barely taste, business calls that couldn't wait despite the hour, and the hollow echo of his own thoughts for company. At 43, Marcus wore his success like armor. His tailored Brioni suit concealed a body kept rigidly fit by pre-dawn sessions with trainers paid to push him to his limits. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes were the only concession to age, a map of sleepless nights spent building Harrington Technologies from a garage startup to the AI giant that had revolutionized medical diagnostics. His dark hair, once untamed and wild in his coding days, was now precisely cut, with distinguished threads of silver at the temples that he refused to dye despite his PR team's suggestions. He checked his watch, a rare Patek Philippe that had belonged to his father, the only inheritance from a man who had abandoned the family when Marcus was 8, leaving his mother to work 3 jobs while raising him in their cramped apartment in Queens. The watch had arrived in the mail on his 30th birthday with no note, just a return address for a law firm in Arizona. Marcus had kept it as a reminder, though of what he wasn't entirely sure, perhaps that some debts could never be paid with money. The maitre d' approached with practiced deference. "Mr. Harrington, your Dover sole will be ready momentarily. Would you care for another Macallan in the meantime?" Marcus nodded, not bothering to look up from the quarterly projections on his tablet. The restaurant's ambient noise, the gentle clink of silverware, the hushed conversations of the wealthy and powerful, usually provided the perfect white noise for his work. But tonight, something pulled at his attention, a familiar cadence among the murmurs. A laugh. Not just any laugh, but one etched into his memory, one that had once been the soundtrack to his rare moments of happiness. A laugh he hadn't heard in nearly 6 years. His eyes lifted involuntarily, scanning the room until they found her, seated at a table by the window. Sophia Chun, the woman who had walked away from him when his work had consumed him entirely, when the company had teetered between breakthrough and bankruptcy, and he had chosen the former at the expense of everything else. She looked different, her black hair shorter now, falling just above her shoulders, her face somehow softer yet more defined. She wore a simple navy dress that he didn't recognize, though he would have once known every item in her wardrobe. But it wasn't Sophia that caused his breath to catch. It was her companions. 3 children, identical in every way discernible from across the room, sat around her table. 3 boys with jet black hair and solemn expressions, each methodically cutting their food with a precision that seemed uncanny for children who couldn't be more than 5 years old. 5 years. The math wasn't difficult, even for a mind distracted by shock. Marcus felt the room tilt slightly. He set down his glass with more force than intended, drawing a concerned glance from a nearby server. The children were the spitting image of Marcus himself at that age. The same serious set to their mouths, the same analytical gaze as they surveyed their surroundings. It was like looking at old photographs come to life, multiplied by 3. His first thought wasn't of fatherhood or missed opportunity. It was betrayal. The sharp, acrid taste of it filled his mouth as he calculated backward. They must have been conceived right before Sophia left, perhaps even as she was planning her exit. 3 children, triplets, that she had never told him about. His children, hidden from him as he built an empire, as he convinced himself that the hollow feeling in his chest was simply the natural void that came with achievement. The scotch he'd been savoring now burned like acid down his throat. Marcus had spent years rationalizing Sophia's departure as inevitable, the natural consequence of his dedication to his vision. He'd told himself, and anyone who dared ask, that she hadn't understood the sacrifices necessary for greatness, that she'd wanted a version of him he couldn't provide, present, attentive, balanced. Words that seemed like weaknesses to a man determined to prove his worth through achievement. But now, watching her with 3 children who were unmistakably his, a different narrative emerged. Perhaps it wasn't that she hadn't understood his sacrifices. Perhaps she simply hadn't been willing to sacrifice their children on the altar of his ambition. Marcus stood, his movements mechanical. The maitre d' materialized at his side, concern evident in his carefully neutral expression. "Is everything all right, Mr. Harrington? Your meal. Cancel it." The words came out harsher than intended. Marcus softened his tone with effort. "Something's come up. Please charge the usual to my account." He should leave. The rational part of his brain, the part that had built algorithms to predict human behavior, the part that had anticipated market shifts and competitor moves with uncanny accuracy, told him to walk out, to process this information privately, to approach the situation with the strategic thinking that had made him a billionaire. Instead, he found himself moving across the restaurant, drawn towards Sophia's table as if pulled by gravity. Each step felt like moving through deep water. His awareness narrowed to the 4 figures ahead of him, oblivious to his approach. One of the boys noticed him first. The child's eyes, Marcus's eyes, widened slightly, a flash of recognition passing over his face though they had never met. The boy tugged at Sophia's sleeve, and she turned, her expression shifting from maternal contentment to shock in an instant. Marcus! His name on her lips still had the power to unravel him, even after all this time. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade, leaving them in a bubble of silence that thrummed with tension. The other diners, sensing drama unfolding, pretended not to watch while stealing glances at the tableau. The lone billionaire confronting the elegant woman and her 3 identical sons. "Sophia." Marcus struggled to keep his voice even. "I see you've been busy." Her chin lifted slightly, a gesture he remembered well, her preparation for battle. "This isn't the place. When would be convenient? Another 5 years, perhaps." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. Marcus had built his reputation on control, on never revealing weakness or emotion in business or in public. Yet here he stood, trembling with rage and something else, something that felt dangerously like grief. The children watched him with identical expressions of cautious curiosity. One of them, the one who had noticed him first, spoke up, his voice small but clear. "Are you the man from the magazine? The one who makes the computers that help doctors?" The simple question punctured Marcus's anger like a needle to a balloon. The child knew who he was, at least in part. Sophia hadn't completely erased him. "Yes," Marcus answered, his voice softening instinctively. "I'm Marcus Harrington." "I'm Edward," the boy replied solemnly, then pointed to his brothers. "That's Alexander, and that's William." Names. They had names, personalities, lives that had been unfolding parallel to his own, unseen and unknown. Marcus felt dizzy with the weight of this revelation. These weren't abstract concepts of children he might have had someday. They were real, flesh and blood, a part of him that had been living and breathing in the world without his knowledge. Sophia stood, placing herself slightly between Marcus and the children, a protective gesture that cut him to the quick. Boys, I need to speak with Mr. Harrington privately for a moment. Please finish your desserts. She moved toward a small alcove near the restrooms, clearly expecting Marcus to follow. He did, feeling the eyes of the restaurant on his back, aware that this moment would likely be leaked to the tabloids before the night was over. Marcus Harrington, tech titan, discovers secret family in public confrontation. The headlines wrote themselves. When they were relatively secluded, Sophia turned to face him, her composure intact but her eyes betraying her tension. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her mouth, the slight shadows beneath her eyes, evidence of the challenges of raising 3 children alone. It made him both ache for her and burn with renewed anger. Why? The question contained multitudes. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you leave? Why did you keep them from me? Sophia's laugh was short and without humor. Why? You're asking me why? You were gone, Marcus. Physically present sometimes, but gone in every way that mattered. 70, 80-hour work weeks. Missing dinners, birthdays, anniversaries. Sleeping at the office more often than at home. That was temporary. We were on the verge of. It was never temporary. She interrupted, her voice low but intense. There was always another milestone, another round of funding, another product launch. I found out I was pregnant a week after you missed our anniversary dinner, the 3rd year in a row, to close a deal with Westridge Capital. Marcus remembered that night. The deal had added millions to the company's valuation and set them on the path to their first major acquisition. He considered it a gift to their future. He'd never imagined that future wouldn't include her. When the doctor told me it was triplets, I knew. Sophia continued, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. I knew I'd be raising them essentially alone, watching you drift further away as the company consumed more of you. I couldn't do it, Marcus. Not to myself and not to them. So you just disappeared? Changed your number? Moved out of state? You didn't think I deserved to know I had children? His voice rose slightly, and he forced himself to lower it again, aware of their semi-public location. Sophia's expression hardened. I left a letter explaining everything. I told you about the pregnancy. I gave you my parents' address in Boston, where I was staying. I said I needed time, that we needed to figure out what co-parenting would look like because I couldn't be with you anymore, but I never intended to keep them from you. Marcus stared at her, confusion replacing anger. What letter? Sophia, I never received any letter. Her eyes widened slightly, disbelief evident. I left it on your desk at home, the one in the study where you actually spent time. I called your assistant 2 weeks later when I hadn't heard from you. She said you'd made it clear you didn't want any contact from me. Melissa told you that? Marcus felt as if the floor were shifting beneath him. Melissa had been his assistant during that critical growth period, a ruthlessly efficient woman who had protected his time with dragon-like ferocity. She'd left the company 3 years ago to start her own business, with a generous severance package and Marcus's blessing. She said you were focused on the SoftBank deal and couldn't afford distractions. Sophia's voice wavered for the first time. I called twice more over the next month. Same response. Eventually, I accepted that the company was your priority. I stopped trying. Marcus's mind raced, reconstructing those chaotic weeks after Sophia's departure. He'd been devastated but had channeled that pain into work, assuming she'd simply outgrown him or found someone else. Melissa had indeed shielded him from unnecessary distractions during the SoftBank negotiations. He'd given her that authority. But to intercept a letter about his children? To lie about Sophia's calls? I never knew, he said finally, the words inadequate against the weight of years lost. I never saw any letter. Melissa never told me you called. Sophia studied his face, searching for the truth. Whatever she saw there seemed to convince her. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the righteous anger that had sustained her partially deflating. Would it have mattered? She asked quietly. If you had known, would you have changed anything? Or would you have just sent money and continued building your empire? The question struck at Marcus's core. 6 years ago, consumed by ambition and the desperate need to prove himself, would he have been capable of being the father these boys deserved? Or would he have treated fatherhood as another project to be managed, delegated, and optimized? Before he could answer, Edward appeared at Sophia's side, tugging at her dress. "Mom, William is getting tired." Marcus looked down at the boy, his son, and saw himself in the serious set of the child's mouth, the analytical gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. But there was something else there too, something purely Sophia in the gentle way he looked at his mother, the instinctive concern for his brother. "We should go," Sophia said, glancing at her watch. "It's past their bedtime." "Please," Marcus said, hating the pleading note in his voice but unable to suppress it. "I need to talk to you more, to understand everything, to meet them properly." Sophia hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she reached into her purse and extracted a business card. "I'm in the city until Sunday. I'm a pediatric surgeon at Boston Children's Hospital now. Call tomorrow, and we can arrange something." Marcus took the card, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. Even that slight contact sent a jolt through him. Not desire, exactly, but recognition. This woman had once known him better than anyone. This woman had carried and raised his children. "I'll call first thing," he promised. She nodded, then turned to rejoin her table. Their sons, leaving Marcus standing alone in the alcove, the business card clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He watched as she efficiently gathered their things, helped the boys with their jackets, and left a credit card for the bill. The practiced movements of a single mother who had learned to manage everything on her own. One of the boys, Alexander or William, he couldn't tell from this distance, glanced back at him, a look of open curiosity on his face. Then they were gone, disappearing through the restaurant's revolving door into the New York night. Marcus returned to his table, ignoring the curious glances from the other diners. His untouched scotch waited for him, as did his tablet with the quarterly projections that had seemed so important an hour ago. He sat heavily, his mind reeling with revelations. Children. He had children. 3 boys who shared his DNA, his features, perhaps even his aptitudes and interests. 3 human beings he had helped create, but had no hand in shaping. The thought was simultaneously exhilarating and devastating. And Sophia. She hadn't simply abandoned him as he'd believed all these years. She'd reached out, tried to include him, only to be blocked by someone he had trusted. The betrayal stung, but it also forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had created the conditions that made such a betrayal possible. His single-minded focus on success, his delegation of his personal life, his emotional unavailability, all had contributed to his current reality. Marcus signaled for the check, suddenly needing to be anywhere but this restaurant with its judging eyes and whispered conversations. The maitre d' approached, concern evident on his face. "Mr. Harrington, is everything all right? Your dinner." "Everything's fine," Marcus interrupted, handing over his black card. "Family matter." Family. The word felt foreign on his tongue, yet undeniably right. He had a family. Not the theoretical future family he occasionally envisioned in abstract terms, but a real, existing family with histories and dynamics already established without him. Outside, the autumn air was crisp with the promise of winter. Marcus dismissed his waiting driver with a generous tip and decided to walk, needing the physical movement to match the churning of his thoughts. The city pulsed around him. Lights, traffic, people rushing toward their destinations. But for once, he was oblivious to its energy. His phone rang. The screen displayed Lawrence Chun, board chairman, a call he would normally take regardless of the hour. Tonight, he silenced it without hesitation. Instead, he found himself pulling up his browser, typing Edward, Alexander, William Chun along with Boston into the search bar. Nothing significant appeared. They were too young to have digital footprints, but the search itself felt momentous. For the first time, Marcus was acknowledging them as real, as people he needed to know. His next search was for Sophia. This yielded results. Her medical credentials, articles she'd published in pediatric journals, a brief mention in Boston Magazine's Top Doctors issue. Dr. Sophia Chun, pioneering minimally invasive surgical techniques for infants. Pride swelled unexpectedly in his chest. She had achieved her dreams too, building her career while raising their children alone. Marcus stopped walking, finding himself at the entrance to Central Park. The paths were still populated despite the late hour. Couples strolling hand in hand, joggers getting in their miles, the occasional tourist trying to capture the magic of New York at night. He entered, drawn to the relative quiet, the illusion of solitude in the heart of the city. As he walked, memories of Sophia resurfaced. Not just their ending, but their beginning. How they met at a tech conference where she, then a medical resident, had challenged his presentation on AI diagnostics with questions so incisive they continued their debate over coffee. Then dinner, then breakfast the next morning. How she'd made him laugh more in that first 24 hours than he had in the previous year. How she'd seen through his carefully constructed persona to the hungry, driven boy from Queens who still felt he had something to prove. For 3 years, they'd been partners in the truest sense. She'd supported his vision, offered perspectives he'd missed, kept him grounded when success began to change the people around him. And then, gradually, the company had grown, demands on his time had increased, and the balance had shifted. He'd assumed her understanding was limitless, that her love could withstand his absences, his distraction, his single-minded focus on building something that would outlast him. He'd been wrong, and now, 6 years later, he was confronting the true cost of that miscalculation. Marcus found a bench overlooking the lake, the city skyline reflected in its dark surface. He sat, suddenly exhausted by the weight of all he had missed, all he had lost without even knowing it. 5 birthdays, first words, first steps, the unique personalities that had undoubtedly developed in each of his sons. His sons. The phrase echoed in his mind, foreign yet undeniable. For perhaps the first time since Sophia had left, Marcus allowed himself to feel the full measure of his loss. Not just of her, but of the life they might have built together, the father he might have been if he'd made different choices. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around that pain crumbled, leaving him vulnerable under the indifferent stars. Tomorrow, he would call the number on Sophia's card. Tomorrow, he would begin the complicated process of entering lives already in progress, of learning to be a father to boys who had never known his presence. Tomorrow, he would face the consequences of prioritizing empire over family. But tonight, Marcus Harrington, billionaire, tech visionary, absent father, sat alone in the park and mourned for the man he might have been, for the years he could never reclaim, and for the simple truth he had been running from since his own father had walked away, that no amount of wealth or achievement could fill the void left by broken connections. His phone vibrated again. Another board member, another crisis that had seemed life or death just hours ago. Marcus turned the device off completely, something he hadn't done in years. The quarterly projections could wait. The acquisition negotiations could pause. For once, something mattered more than Harrington Technologies. 3 boys with his eyes and Sophia's smile. 3 chances he didn't deserve but desperately wanted. 3 reasons to finally confront the hollowness at the center of the empire he had built. Marcus stood, his decision made. Whatever it took, time, money, humility, patience, he would find a way to be part of their lives. Not as the billionaire tech titan, but simply as their father, flawed and human, and trying his best to make up for lost time. As he walked back toward the park entrance, his steps lighter with purpose, he thought of something his mother had told him long ago, when he'd asked why his father had never returned. Some men run toward things, others run away. The brave ones stand still long enough to see what's right in front of them. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus was ready to stand still, to see what was right in front of him. A second chance he hadn't known he needed, a family he hadn't known he had, and perhaps, if he was very fortunate, a future richer than any he could have designed alone.